If you're trying to argue that something is better, right? It's a higher quality, right? It's a better artist. Okay, whatever that classification is, even if we're going to limit it to a genre, limit it to things that have certain things in common, right? Then we need to ask ourselves, okay, is that an objective thing? Or are we still just saying, well, maybe I'm just subjective in that I like music that has complex things, right? And maybe my subjective bias is I like simple things. Good, right? See, the debates are already begun, right? Because there are so many feelings that come up in this. All right, let's see if we can elicit some more feelings. Okay, so when we talk about definitions of art, right, to give us a little bit of framework here for these debates, if we're asking whether or not something counts as a piece of art, one of the 4 classic approaches is to say that it counts as art if it does one of these things. Now, you could say it has to be just one of these things, but typically if it does at least one of these things, right, we can give it some sort of credit for being a piece of art. The first one is that we want to give something credit as a piece of art if it adequately involves some level of representation, right? And so we value things that try to represent in some form or another, whether literally, right, or abstractly. We value all different types of representation. It doesn't even have to be entirely accurate, which is interesting, right? But we tend to value representations of things in the world. Why do you think we do that? Why do we like a good picture of something? Right? So oftentimes when thinking about past lived experiences, what are our sources to draw upon, right? Our memories or someone else's account, right? And so the ability to visually capture, right, has been really important throughout human history, right? The development of photography, right? Certain developments in painting techniques such that we moved from, two-dimensional imagery, right, to things that have more dimension, right, that give them depth. We really value these as reflections of our own history, right, our human history. So we value those in terms of human memory, right, as in terms of our species, but also individual memory, right? If you have something that's really important, you want to see a representation of that, right? Maybe to elicit that memory or to re-elicit that emotion, right? Music can do the same thing. How often do you listen to a piece of music and you're reminded about how you felt the first time you listened to it, right? Or at a time in your life when the song was significantly important. Why else might we value representation? Think about it in terms of the question of whether or not any truth can be captured in art, reflected in art. And so there's even a switch between technological representation and human representation, right? Because you're definitely going to get less accuracy with people who are drawing the people in the courtroom. I'm sure that's maybe not exactly how they looked, right? Versus having the camera in the courtroom that captures every minute. But yeah, there's something that is being conveyed, perhaps an accuracy, right? Or a side of the story that maybe would have otherwise been unavailable, right? So that's why it's really again, for feminists especially, to address the exclusion in the history of art, right? If art is supposed to convey something about the truth of human experience, right? And reality and the nature of reality, all the things we've been talking about, right? What is real? What is knowledge? Right? What is God? All of these big questions. Well, our depiction of that has been quite narrow throughout history. And so if we want to get a broader understanding of the world outside of our own limited perspective, right, especially if you are some sort of standpoint theorist, well, then maybe I might not be able to experience the world in person, but I can look at a lot of representations of the world, right? That's a pretty decent, second option. If I can't go out into the world and experience these things myself, well, I can expose myself to as many representations of the diversity in the world as possible, right? So seeing the world through someone else's eyes, right? Through the eyes of an artist, right? That's really important. Good. Yeah, this is This is really important now as well. There has been, a lot of critique about certain photographers and the way that they light darker skinned actors and actresses when they photograph them, and the way that artists of color choose to depict themselves, right? It's very different, the way they choose to reflect their skin color. So when you see Black artists painting Black figures, they don't paint them with Black skin, right? They don't paint them with those dark, they use very vibrant colors, right? And we don't see white representations of, Annie Leibovitz is thank you. She's the photographer I was thinking of. Her pictures were awful. So bad, right? But the idea is that, the way that we choose to represent certain individuals is through the eyes of the artist, right? So again, representation is going to matter in terms of that as well, right? How we look, whose lenses are we looking through? How are we depicting the world? And how are we representing them? Good. And the next one is, of course, going to be expression, right? The idea that art is a way of communicating the artist's feelings and prompting others to experience those same feelings, right?